Hello, multi-mephitic ministers of manifolds, and thank you to Frans Larsen for providing the malt mention for Ralphie Review 919 Extras, in which, having reviewed a single malt whisky, which I usually do, but not always, I then move on to other topics of conversation which malt mates, including yourself, are going to find useful, helpful and informative. And my topic for Ralphie Review 919 Extras is to do with something which affects us all and irritates us enormously, and it's to do with batch variation. And I'll start by just explaining batch variation. Batch variation is when you buy a whisky or you're given a sample of whisky and you particularly enjoy it, so you go out to buy a bottle or another bottle, and it may be a few months later, it may be a year later, and when you buy that bottle, you get home, you take the top off, you pour a glass, and immediately your smile turns to a frown, and you're a little bit puzzled because the whisky doesn't quite taste like it did the last time. And what's confusing you initially is your underappreciation of just how good an archivist your sense of smell and taste is. Even for someone relatively experienced, they can have one bottle of a single malt followed by another bottle of a single malt a month later, a year later, 2 years later, and immediately spot that it's not quite what it was. Now, there's two reasons that a whisky can change. It can change in quality or it can change in flavour, but maintain the quality. And this is something that we gain with experience. We start to notice this, for example, with Springbanks, and it's really to do with small batch variation, single cask variation, or cask used variations due to the signature that casks impose on a single malt as it's maturing. For example, sherry, Madeira, port, bourbon, white wines, red wines, marsalas, all these permutations, or the combination of casks in permutations. And if the casks have been good, and if they've worked with the single malt, we'll taste a version of the whisky which confuses us initially, but once we get to know it, we find that the quality's fine. The taste is different, but the quality's good. Whereas there's some other whiskies we buy which it's a lot more concerning because it looks the same, it seems to be the same kind of bottle, same colour, but it tastes not as good. It is rarely that you get a whisky that tastes significantly better than first time round, because it's the nature of the challenges within the Scotch whisky industry in accessing, obtaining and paying for good quality casks these days. It's something that the smart distilleries have spent a lot of money years ago investing in getting quality oak properly coopered into casks specifically for their own use. And it costs money, but having said that, the actual cost of producing whisky in relation to the price that it goes on sale for is pretty small. In fact, it's very small. The big costs are in duty paid to the government and taxes if you're in the UK, or importation duties and bureaucratic duties if it's whisky's getting imported to another country like Australia and Canada, Sweden, Norway, great example. That can really affect the price of a whisky, and how much of that whisky, when you're paying for it, is not actually in anything related to how much it actually cost to produce. It used to be, let me see, about 10 years ago that you could produce a litre of single malt Scotch whisky in a pot still for £2.50. Very reasonable amount of money at that point, but it's more than doubled now. I mean, the cost of energy alone is just eye-wateringly outrageous. And this creates a dilemma for the distillers. They want to keep hold of the customers, but who are they catering for? What do they need to do? Can they cut costs and use cheaper casks, or use the same casks more often, scrape out the inside, re-toast, re-scorch, re-bake the casks, re-char them, to try and get a little bit more life out of them? Can they reduce energy costs by speeding up the still slightly, making it run faster, getting a more efficient alcohol yield out the grain that they're using by a few more percentage points in terms of volume? You can only go so far, and the more you sanitize the product, the more you turn the whiskey into something more like vodka, it loses its identity. It loses its signature. And we remember this. The smell and the taste are very acute senses that we have. They're very good librarians and archivists. And a few months later, a year later, a few years later, we'll come back to a whiskey and we'll say, oh, it's a bit younger tasting. Why would that be? Higher proportion of refill casks, second refill casks, third fill, even fourth fill casks are being used for maturation to cut costs. So it cuts down on the volume and the quality of the flavour. But it's not as if they reduced the price, is it? Well, not initially. Although latterly, when you have brands which are of less substance, see, I'm picking words carefully here, brands which are of less substance than they used to be, you'll increasingly see that people are not interested in them. They're not flying off the shelves like Springbanks, Kilkerns and Daffmills. Although in Daffmill's case it's because there's so little produced. But it's still a damn good single malt whisky, and it's authentically presented for quality, for integrity, for smell and taste. But there's other brands out there that you look at them. I mean, I saw recently a 21-year-old Bushmills, 21-year-old, 40% volume, looked like it had caramel in it, asking £200 odd. Too expensive, no sale. Even when you go out to buy now, the experiences of disappointment which have registered from previous purchases leave you wary, defensive, and more easily disappointed next time round. I've seen it happen with Highland Park. You get fabulous Highland Parks. You really, really do. But some of the official bottlings are just, they are not doing that distillery any justice whatsoever. And it's not just Highland Park. Glenmorangie had a very good example of that recently with a harshly oaked permutation called Cognac Cask Matured, 13-year-old. And it was an absolute brand killer of cask influence. And it really, I mean, fine if you like harsh oak notes, but even people that don't have maybe have just a few years experience are really going to pick up on that and be disappointed, particularly in relation to the price. And perhaps this is one reason why people are exploring further afield. Non-Scotch whiskies, like for example Kavalan, which has still got a growing reputation. It's a Taiwanese whisky. Another example would be some of the French whiskies, the peated ones. They're getting a resurge of interest happening now as people start to explore further afield because they don't anticipate the sort of disappointment that they've had from a bad batch. Always recognise in terms of smell, in terms of taste, and importantly, your own reaction. Always trust your own instincts. And if you're not sure, hand a sample to a friend to verify or not verify whether you're right. Sure, now and again, your palate can be out of synchronisation due to medication or due to just how you're feeling. Maybe you're getting over a cold. Maybe you've had an injection of some vaccine or something. Perhaps you've had some steroid ointment. All these things can factor in. So just be aware of that. But how do we respond when we've had a bad batch? Well, it's buyer take care and buyer beware. Simple as that. Put it down to experience, but make sure you log that experience and keep it in your archive. Follow the information online. I'm doing my best to help. Some whiskies are good, some, seriously, I'm increasingly disappointed in. One of those will be coming up shortly. I'll tell you all about it. But hey ho, it's all part of the journey, and part of the mission is to sift out the best from the rest and then to share it. Because in doing so, producers will make better whiskey, and producers who are making less whiskey must be prepared to make less profit, to discount their whiskey and spend more in marketing them, and then dealing with people's disappointment. And there you have it, malt mates. Have a good one.